There are places in this world where darkness doesn't just visit. It settles in, wraps itself around the walls, and becomes part of the foundation. The Whitworth estate was one of those places. Perched on a hillside far from the nearest town, it stood like a monument to wealth and power, its iron gates crowned with ornate letters that spelled out a name once whispered with respect, and later, with fear. From the outside, the mansion appeared grand, 3 stories of stone and timber, with windows that caught the dying light of every sunset like watchful eyes. But those who lived nearby knew better than to admire it. They knew that some houses don't just shelter families. Some houses consume them. For generations, the Whitworths were seen as untouchable. They owned land that stretched beyond sight, controlled businesses that filled their coffers with gold, and wore their wealth like armor against the world. But money, no matter how much of it you have, can't silence everything. And in the case of the Whitworths, it couldn't silence the whispers. Stories followed them like shadows. Tales of strange lights in the windows late at night, of servants who entered the estate and were never seen again, of children whose laughter turned to screams behind closed doors. The townspeople learned not to ask questions. They learned that curiosity about the Whitworths had a price, and it was one most weren't willing to pay. The estate itself seemed to mirror the family's reputation. While other homes aged with grace, the Whitworth mansion aged with menace. Ivy climbed its walls like grasping fingers. The gardens, once meticulously kept, grew wild and tangled, as if nature itself recoiled from coming too close. Even on bright summer days, the house seemed draped in shadow, the kind that clings to your skin and makes you want to look over your shoulder. It was a place that didn't welcome visitors, and those who did venture too close often left with an unshakable feeling that they'd been watched by something far more ancient than the family who lived within. The roots of this darkness can be traced back to one man, Nathaniel Whitworth, the patriarch who built the family's fortune and unknowingly sealed their fate. Nathaniel was not born into wealth. He clawed his way up from nothing, driven by an ambition so fierce it bordered on obsession. To him, the world was divided into 2 kinds of people, those who took what they wanted, and those too weak to stop them. He had no patience for weakness, not in business, not in his household, and certainly not in his own blood. His methods for accumulating wealth were as ruthless as they were effective. Nathaniel acquired land through intimidation, destroyed competitors through sabotage, and silenced anyone who stood in his way with threats, or worse. Rumors swirled that he had made deals with dangerous men, that money changed hands in darkened rooms where promises were sealed not with handshakes, but with blood. He built his empire on the suffering of others, and he did so without a shred of remorse. To Nathaniel, compassion was a luxury only fools could afford. Inside the estate, his cruelty only intensified. He ruled his family with an iron fist, demanding absolute obedience and perfection. Mistakes were met with punishment, sometimes physical, sometimes psychological, always cruel. His wife learned quickly to keep her head down and her voice silent. His children learned that love, if it existed at all in that house, came with conditions they could never meet. Nathaniel believed that discipline forged strength, that fear bred respect. What he created instead was a legacy of trauma that would poison every generation that followed. The foundation he laid for the Whitworth name wasn't built on stone and mortar, it was built on pain, and pain has a way of seeping into everything it touches. As the years passed and Nathaniel's grip on the family tightened, something else began to take root within the estate's walls. It started small, servants whispering about odd occurrences, things moved in the night, doors that wouldn't stay closed, cold spots in rooms where no draft could reach. At first, these incidents were dismissed as the imagination of overworked staff or the natural settling of an aging house. But the incidents didn't stop. They grew more frequent, more disturbing, more impossible to ignore. One by one, servants began to vanish. They would retire to their quarters at night and simply never be seen again. No goodbyes, no packed belongings, no trace of where they'd gone. When questioned, Nathaniel would offer a dismissive explanation. They'd quit without notice, run off in the night, proving themselves unreliable. But the townspeople noticed a pattern. Those who worked at the Whitworth estate had a habit of disappearing, and those who remained came back to town with haunted eyes and lips sealed tight about what they'd witnessed. The children of the household began speaking of voices. Late at night, they claimed, they could hear whispers coming from within the walls, soft at first, then growing louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to communicate or perhaps trying to get out. The younger Whitworth children would wake screaming, babbling about shadows that moved on their own, about figures standing at the foot of their beds, about hands reaching out from the darkness. Their parents dismissed these as nightmares, products of overactive imaginations. But the terror in those children's eyes told a different story. Neighbors who lived close enough to see the estate reported hearing things as well. On certain nights, when the wind was still and the air hung heavy, cries would drift down from the hillside, long, anguished wails that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Some claimed they heard children sobbing. Others swore they heard a woman scream, cut short as if smothered. And on the darkest nights, when even the moon refused to shine, there were sounds like digging, like something being dragged, like earth being moved in haste and secrecy. The house itself began to feel alive. Those who entered, and fewer dared to, spoke of an oppressive atmosphere, a weight in the air that made breathing difficult. Rooms grew cold without reason. Doors slammed shut with no one near them. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, stretching across floors and walls in shapes that didn't match any source of light. It was as if the estate had absorbed decades of cruelty, of suffering, of secrets too dark to speak aloud, and now those secrets had given the house a consciousness of its own. The Whitworths lived not in a home, but in a monument to their sins, and the walls remembered everything. The weight of this legacy fell heaviest on the Whitworth children. Born into a world of wealth, but raised in an atmosphere of fear, they were trapped between two realities, the public face of privilege and the private nightmare behind closed doors. Each child responded differently to the darkness that surrounded them, but none escaped unscathed. The eldest son, Thomas, tried to follow in his father's footsteps, attempting to mirror Nathaniel's ruthlessness in hopes of earning approval. But where Nathaniel had been calculating and controlled, Thomas was reckless and cruel. He tortured small animals as a boy, graduated to tormenting servants as a young man, and eventually turned his violence toward anyone who dared challenge him. His father saw potential in this brutality, grooming Thomas to inherit the family empire. But Thomas's mind had already begun to fracture. He heard the voices too, louder than his siblings, and they told him terrible things. By the time he reached adulthood, it was impossible to tell where his own cruelty ended and the house's influence began. The daughters fared no better. Eleanor, the eldest girl, retreated into herself, spending hours staring at walls, speaking only in whispers, flinching at sudden movements. She would sometimes be found walking the halls at night, her eyes open but seeing nothing, her lips moving in silent conversation with something no one else could perceive. Her parents called it melancholy. The servants called it possession. Victoria, the younger daughter, took a different path. She rebelled. She screamed when told to be silent, ran when ordered to stay still, fought against every rule and restriction imposed upon her. Her defiance earned her brutal punishments, but she refused to break. Until one autumn evening, she simply vanished. No note, no warning, no trace. The family claimed she'd run away, eloped with an unsuitable man. But her bedroom looked untouched, her belongings still in place. And sometimes, on quiet nights, servants swore they could hear her voice calling from somewhere deep within the estate, begging to be let out. The youngest, a boy named Samuel, never had a chance. Born into a house already steeped in darkness, he seemed to absorb it from his first breath. He rarely spoke, rarely played, rarely showed any emotion at all. He would sit for hours in the same spot, staring at nothing, responding to no one. As he grew older, he began to display unsettling knowledge, speaking of events that happened before his birth, describing rooms in the house that had been sealed for decades, mentioning names of people long dead as if they were old friends. The family tried to hide him away, keeping him locked in the upper floors where visitors wouldn't see. But hiding him didn't change what he'd become, a living reminder that something deeply wrong had taken root in the Whitworth bloodline. The trauma didn't end with that generation. It multiplied, twisted, evolved with each new child born under the Whitworth name. They carried it in their blood, in their bones, in the way they moved through the world with a particular kind of caution, always looking over their shoulders, always waiting for the next terrible thing. The curse, if that's what it was, didn't discriminate. It touched them all. As the family's reputation in town shifted from respected to feared, efforts to maintain their image became increasingly desperate. But certain events couldn't be hidden, no matter how much money or influence the Whitworths wielded. Scandals began to surface, each one more disturbing than the last, each one adding another layer to the legend of the cursed family on the hill. It started with the death of Nathaniel's wife, Catherine. The official cause was listed as a weak heart, a sudden failure in the night. But those who prepared her body for burial spoke in hushed tones about the bruises they found, the look of terror frozen on her face, the way her fingers were torn and bloody, as if she'd been clawing at something, or trying to escape from something. The funeral was swift and private. Questions were discouraged. The matter was considered closed. But the whispers never stopped. Then came the incident with the groundskeeper. He'd worked the Whitworth estate for 15 years, a quiet man who kept to himself and did his job without complaint. One morning, he didn't show up for work. A search party was organized, and what they found in the woods at the edge of the property chilled them to their core. The groundskeeper's body, or what remained of it, was discovered in a shallow grave, half covered by fallen leaves. The state of corpse suggested he'd been there for weeks, yet he'd been seen alive just 3 days prior. Even stranger, his mouth was filled with dirt, as if he'd been buried alive and tried to scream his way out. The authorities investigated, but the Whitworths had friends in powerful places. The death was ruled an unfortunate accident. The groundskeeper was buried quickly. His family was paid handsomely for their silence. More deaths followed, each one stranger than the last. A visiting cousin developed a sudden illness within hours of arriving at the estate and was dead before morning. A business associate of Nathaniel's, who'd threatened to expose certain dealings, was found drowned in the estate's fountain, though he'd been seen heading to his carriage to leave just moments before. A young maid who'd confided to a friend about terrible things happening in the house fell from a third-story window, a window that had been painted shut for years. With each incident, the Whitworths deployed the same strategy. Swift burials, generous payments to grieving families, carefully worded statements to the authorities, and the subtle but unmistakable threat that asking too many questions would have consequences. They became masters of the cover-up, experts at making inconvenient truths disappear. But they couldn't control everything. They couldn't stop the stories that spread through town like wildfire. They couldn't silence the growing conviction among the townspeople that the Whitworth family was marked by something far worse than bad luck. They couldn't erase the fact that death followed their name like a faithful hound. And beneath the scandals, beneath the hurried burials and sealed coffins, beneath the official stories and paid-off authorities, a darker truth festered. The estate's basement had been expanded over the years, new rooms added, old ones sealed off. Servants were forbidden from entering certain areas. Strange sounds echoed up through the floorboards at night. Sounds like scraping, like muffled cries, like something heavy being dragged across stone. The family's secrets weren't just buried in the graveyard. They were buried in the foundation of the house itself. And as the years passed, those foundations began to crack. By the time the last generation of Whitworths came of age, the family's fate was already sealed. The wealth that Nathaniel had fought so viciously to accumulate began to evaporate. Bad investments, legal troubles, and mounting debts eroded the fortune piece by piece. But it wasn't just money they were losing, it was their grip on sanity, on reality, on life itself. Thomas, who'd been groomed to lead the family into a new era of prosperity, instead led it toward destruction. His paranoia grew with each passing year. He became convinced that everyone around him was plotting his downfall, that the servants were spies, that the walls were watching, that the house itself wanted him dead. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating, spent his days and nights prowling the corridors with wild eyes and a loaded pistol. His end came on a winter night when he was found at the bottom of the grand staircase, his neck broken, his eyes wide open and staring at something no one else could see. The house had claimed another Whitworth. Eleanor never left her room in the final years. She sat by the window, rocking slowly, speaking in languages no one recognized, her hair gone completely white though she was barely 40. When she finally passed, it was almost a relief. The servants who cleaned out her room found the walls covered in scratches, hundreds of them, as if she'd spent years clawing at the plaster. And written over and over in those scratches, barely legible, were 2 words, "Let me out." Samuel, the strange youngest son, outlived his siblings, but not by much. He was discovered in the sealed basement, surrounded by dozens of old journals that documented decades of the family's darkest secrets, accounts of murders covered up, servants disappeared, business rivals eliminated, all recorded in meticulous detail. How Samuel had accessed these journals, or why he'd chosen that particular room to die in, no one could say. But his body was found with a smile on his face, as if he'd finally found the answers he'd been searching for his entire life. One by one, the last Whitworths met ends that seemed almost poetic in their horror, as if the universe itself was ensuring they paid for the sins of their ancestors. The few who tried to escape the family's fate found that distance meant nothing. The curse, or whatever darkness clung to the Whitworth name, followed them wherever they went. Within a decade, the family line had ended entirely, snuffed out like a candle in a cold wind. The estate stood empty for years after that. No one wanted to buy it, no matter how low the price dropped. It became a place that children dared each other to approach, that travelers went out of their way to avoid, that locals spoke of only in whispers and warnings. The iron gates rusted, the windows shattered, the roof caved in. Nature began to reclaim what the Whitworths had once claimed for themselves. But even in ruin, even abandoned and decaying, the house maintained its oppressive presence on the hillside. It stood as a monument to a family consumed by its own darkness, a reminder that some legacies aren't meant to be inherited. They're meant to be buried and forgotten. But here's the thing about darkness. It doesn't disappear just because you stop looking at it. And here's the thing about the Whitworth estate. It may be empty now, but empty doesn't always mean uninhabited. Even today, those who venture too close report seeing lights in the windows, hearing voices carried on the wind, feeling watched by eyes that have no living person behind them. Some say the Whitworths never truly left, that they're trapped within those walls, doomed to repeat their sins for eternity. Others say the house itself has become something more than wood and stone, that it's alive with all the suffering it witnessed, all the secrets it keeps, all the darkness it absorbed over generations of cruelty and violence. The truth, whatever it may be, remains locked behind those rusted gates and crumbling walls. The Whitworth name has faded from memory, reduced to a cautionary tale told on dark nights when the wind howls and the shadows grow long. But the estate remains, waiting on its hillside, patient and eternal. And sometimes, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear them, the whispers, the cries, the secrets that refuse to stay buried. The Whitworth family may be gone, but their story, it seems, is far from over. Some shadows never truly fade. Some curses never truly break. And some houses remember everything.